Thanks to Michigan Technological University and the Baraga County Historical Society for supporting this video. If you drive west through the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, you'll eventually pass a spot that seems out of place. Some 500 miles from Detroit and the heart of the Michigan auto industry, there's a well-manicured Ford logo on the side of the highway, across the street from, well, it's not immediately clear what this is. Welcome to Alberta, Michigan. It's a town not only built by Henry Ford, but painstakingly designed by him. Why? Because one day, Ford more or less looked at this spot and said, you know what we need in the middle of this forest? A utopian sawmill community. This is the story of Alberta and of Henry Ford's northern Michigan operations. AKA, that time Henry Ford rolled into the Upper Peninsula and started buying and building entire towns. For the Ford Motor Company, 1919 was the era of the Model T, one of the first mass-produced affordable cars. So the company was doing great business, and the stage was set for Ford to be a household name for decades to come. But Henry Ford didn't want his decisions at the company being controlled by any other investors. So in 1919, he bought all the stock in the Ford Motor Company and became the sole owner of the whole business. And he realized that for this business to keep being successful, he was going to need two key resources: wood and iron ore. Two things the Upper Peninsula happened to have a lot of. Keeping up the theme of self-reliance, Ford also didn't want to rely on totally outside sources for raw materials. So he started buying and building the supply chain himself. Now, Henry Ford was a fan of the Upper Peninsula. He vacationed and hunted up here, and he wanted to do right by these communities. And for the most part, he did. For instance, the mining industry was starting to wane in this part of the state, and Ford was seen as a source of local jobs. Although I do want to point out that Henry Ford was also famously anti-Semitic, so his goodwill and generosity certainly did not apply to everyone. That said, in his quest for resources, Ford ended up buying more than 500,000 acres in the Upper Peninsula, along with entire towns, and he started creating company towns in several of those spots to his very specific standards. Together, these sites are known as Henry Ford's Northern Michigan Operations, or NMOs. And these weren't super rugged, dirty labor communities. One of Ford's expectations was for cleanliness. He wanted things to be neat and well kept, so even the lumberjacks were well fed and had access to showers. The resources from the NMOs were used to make everything from Model Ts and Model As to trucks throughout the 1930s to wooden army gliders for World War II. But these communities also played a big part in shaping the Upper Peninsula as a whole and beyond. For instance, if you've ever used Kingsford charcoal in your grill, you can ultimately thank Henry Ford's NMOs. Now, today, many of these sites have been all but lost to history. A lot of the major structures just aren't there anymore, let alone the smaller outlying buildings. Except for in one spot. And that brings us back to Alberta. There are multiple stories about how Ford got the idea for this place, but the one reported by Bob Krepke, Ford Motor Company's historian emeritus, is that in 1934, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, yes, that one, and Edward Kingsford were traveling through this area on their way from Ford's summer home. Henry Ford noticed this spot, asked his driver to stop, and promptly decided he was going to build a town here. And thanks to his power and wealth, he did. 1 year later, in 1935, bulldozers rolled in and construction began. When it came to Ford's company towns around the UP, he had a vision that these communities would be centered on one type of work. For Alberta, that work would be logging. So in Ford's mind, he would build a sawmill, and the people living in Alberta would be trained to work at that mill starting in grade school. They'd essentially be raised to be Ford's future workforce. And the village itself would also be self-sufficient. Ford would dam up the creek to give the town water for living and firefighting. Every home would have 2 acres of land to grow food, and really the initial plans were just ambitious, and probably could have called for dozens of additional dwellings. In pursuit of this vision, Ford even designed Alberta's exact layout, so that things were just as he wanted them. And although this dream of a highly controlled company town is a bit dystopian to me and my personal suburban experiences, I will say Ford did believe in providing the best schools, workshops, and more for these communities. Or At least, if Henry Ford approved of you. Now, as for how Ford's vision actually played out, more on that in a minute. For now, I want to step back and share more about the centerpiece of Alberta, the sawmill, because I think this place is fascinating, and I would not say I'm usually someone who's into sawmills. The Alberta sawmill opened in 1936 at the start of the town's history, and it wasn't designed to be a super high output facility. You only needed 14 workers to operate the mill, and it could only cut about 14 to 20,000 board feet per day, depending on the type of wood, which sounds like a huge amount to me, but for comparison, the mill in Kingsford had been cutting 200 to 250,000 board feet per day 10 years earlier. Much of the wood from Alberta was used in other Ford facilities to make parts for cars, but mostly this was a public relations piece and represented part of Ford's vision for an ideal company town. From an engineering standpoint, though, it is also just a really cool facility, and to learn more about how it worked, I went straight to the source. This is Dave Stimick. He was the last head sawyer in Alberta. A sawyer is a person who works at a sawmill, and he still lives in the town doing some beautiful woodworking. To understand more about how this place operated, I met up with Dave in Alberta, and here's what I learned.
This is the log pond here, and when it was running, it was 8 feet deep, and the logs would be brought in and put in here. There was steam coming from the mill, generated steam that heated the log pond for winter. Cutting frozen timber is very hard on the equipment. Plus the log pond would thaw them out if there was mud or rocks. It would thaw them out and it would get all the dirt off of them. But they would float the logs over, go up the bolt chain, and that pipe up above was high pressure water was pumped onto the logs, and they were washed as they were going up the bolt chain into the mill, which is remarkable for 1935 in that era. Well, anyway, this is the basement of the mill, the ground floor, and all of the production was done upstairs. But I wanted to point out these chutes right here. Above where these chutes come down, up above it is a piece of equipment. And all of the sawdust would come down these chutes as that machine was cutting. And in the floor, there's a chain that would bring all the sawdust right down to the boiler at the end of the mill. And that's what made it, so it was a clean, it was like, they call it a dust-free sawmill because there was no waste anywhere. All the waste went right into the boiler and it was used.
That's also huge because sawdust is really flammable, right?
Oh yeah, and dust. Dust in a mill was the worst thing you could do because dust can really ignite and, you know, just go right now. But yeah, it was just the way they operated in those days. And there was never any fires here, no major injuries, anything like that. We can go upstairs where you can actually see the equipment, the working equipment up there.
Yeah, let's do it.
So we got to go up here and check it out. This is the lever for this bolt chain here. When you would put this forward, then it'd activate this chain. And then the logs would come up here. And then, oh, there's the cantook.
Can I follow you or should I not do that?
Absolutely.
Woohoo!
But this person here would turn these logs with this cantook. He would hook the logs and then roll these onto this chain here.
Okay.
So we would have this whole deck full of logs. And that's where I sat right there, and I was operating this machine going back and forth, the carriage. And so that one, they claim that person made or broke the operation on how you cut lumber. And the carriage rides on a rail like a railroad track here, back and forth, back and forth. This is the carriage, and that big saw right there, it's a bandsaw. The wheel is 5 foot diameter. There's a wheel on top and one on the bottom and a bandsaw, just like people have in their little wood shops, only this is a little bigger scale.
Man, so you really knew your stuff. Like you knew your way around the log. Yeah.
Yeah, if you're going to be the sawyer, you have to know your stuff. So there was a lot of decisions. You'd have to be on the ball because this thing moving is dangerous.
Okay, how fast would that go?
As fast as you wanted it to, because that thing could move.
Whew.
And I was never like that, because I used to work on all the other equipment, and there'd be sawyers that would just load you up. And it'd get dangerous. There'd be boards all over because they want to get, oh, I want to cut 20,000 feet today, just so I cut 20,000. But you could be cutting 20,000 feet of garbage.
Sure.
Cut 10,000 of good stuff, and you're better off. Just watch your step.
Happily.
So anyway, yeah, you can see this then, how the log is. And the saw in its cut, that's Yeah.
Okay.
Now this is the edger.
Edger, okay.
Yeah. When you would cut the round log, you'd cut a slab off, and that would go down there. You see the slabs, the outside of the tree.
Oh, yep.
That stuff would go all the way down, and that would get cut into pieces for firewood.
Oh, cool. For the
Yeah.
like for the town?
Yep.
Neat.
Yeah, it'd go down out that belt and into a truck. That is the slab. And then you would have the next board that would come off would be, the slab would come off here. Then you have this board here. In this machine in there, there's little saws. There's saws in there, and you could move these as to how wide you want to make this board. And you run this through there. So you could have a 4 or a 5-inch board as this goes through, and you just adjust these. So you see this board comes through here like that. It comes out like this. Okay. That's why it's called edger. It cuts the edges off the board. He'll take this board out of here, and he'll take it over here, put it on here. And this machine, those saws, you can move them in and out, and that's called the trim saw. So you trim them to 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, whatever you want.
Okay.
So it's called a trimmer.
Neat. And this is it trimming them like this way, 6 feet?
Whatever you want. Yeah.
Or whatever length.
You'd hit, yeah. So then all these little pieces that came off of here went down through these holes here, down into the bin down there, and those would get fed into the boiler too to create heat for the mill.
Neat. So was there originally a grate here? Or is that
No,
just okay?
That was wide open. So that's all those pieces would go down there and they'd go into the boiler too, get burnt, and so it was really efficient. But it's a basic, operation or from a log to a board, and then the lumber would come out, and then the lumber grader, he would be here with his little crayon, and he'd look and he'd say, well, that's a real good board, it'd be a Selectin better. And they'd go out and it'd have an S on it, or however his mark was, and then it'd get down on, like over here, you can see the green chain, it's called the green chain. And the lumber would come down these chains here, and it'd come out here real slowly. This would run slowly. And then you'd have lumber pilers there, and they'd have piles of wood according to what the grade. Number 2, number 3, 3 common, or number 1, number 2, Selectin better, whatever.
Okay.
And they'd pile them accordingly. Then when you get about 1,000 feet in the packet, you put the metal bandings over it.
Okay.
And then move it over and onto a truck and out. History. He who does not know history is condemned to repeat it. Yeah. George Santayana. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Shot in a beer. How can I swear?
The sawmill may have been a success, but Henry Ford's overall dream for Alberta never did come true. Although his original plan called for multiple stages of development, things stopped after phase 1. Mainly, Alberta ended up with 12 houses, a reception building, 2 schoolhouses for different grade levels, a garage, and of course, the sawmill. Still, even with that limited population, Ford got to design and run his town exactly as he wanted. The standards for living in Alberta were extremely strict, right down to how you took care of your yard, painted your house, and managed your garden. Like I mentioned earlier, Ford was a stickler for cleanliness and order. And if you didn't do your maintenance to his specifications, you could be escorted out of town. Maybe surprisingly, the reason Alberta never took off didn't have to do with money, power, or control. Ford had plenty of those. The limiting factor was that in the early 1940s, not long after Alberta was founded, Henry Ford had a stroke, and Alberta and the rest of the northern Michigan operations were really tied to his well-being. See, Ford's relatives weren't on board with the idea of the NMOs, so everyone sort of knew that once Henry was out of the picture, the northern Michigan operations would be shut down. And that's exactly what happened when Henry Ford eventually passed in 1947. In the coming years, the sawmills and lumber camps and other sites were closed. And although people still lived in the towns that Ford had built or managed, it wasn't the same. When it comes to Alberta specifically, the Ford Motor Company closed the sawmill in June 1954. But that's not the end of this place. There is a very good epilogue to this story. That November, the entire town of Alberta was donated to what's now Michigan Technological University, along with roughly 2,000 acres of land. And that began a story that's continuing today. Michigan Tech continued to maintain Alberta and used the sawmill for research, trying to understand the best ways to saw certain woods to get the most value out of them. They actually ended up operating the sawmill for longer than the Ford Motor Company did. Then, after that, the mill served as a public historical site and a museum for a while, starting in the late 90s. Today, the sawmill is closed to the public for safety reasons, but there's a citizen committee working to raise the money to change that, and raise funds that would make this place safe enough to be used as a museum again. There's also a proposal in progress to get this area officially designated as a historical site. Today, Michigan Tech still owns most of the property here, and sawmill aside, Alberta is mainly a place for research and education. Tech's forestry, wildlife, and ecology students get to live here for an entire semester and learn about managing forests, evaluating habitats, cataloging wildlife, and more, depending on their area of study. The College of Forest Resources at Michigan Tech runs the last program in the country to have a semester long-term field camp like this. And in addition to being an incredible classroom, this forest has hosted tons of research projects that have helped people understand this place and the best ways to manage forests across the region. As a 20-something living in 2023, it's hard for me to imagine living in a town like Alberta. I can't imagine living in a town controlled by my boss, or having my company judge how well I'm taking care of my yard. But for a 1930s community surrounded by temperamental lakes, rugged forests, and limited job prospects, I also understand how living somewhere so stable and predictable could have been reassuring. In any case, I think differently about Alberta whenever I drive past it these days, because especially up here, it and the Northern Michigan operations were a major chapter in Michigan's history, and a story I am glad to have learned. Before I go, I want to mention two more things about Alberta that I think you'll be interested in. One, if you're looking for a place to stay in the Upper Peninsula, you can rent one of the houses in Alberta from the Ford Center. Besides getting to explore the town, there's tons of hiking and snowmobiling opportunities nearby, and the lake isn't very far either. You can also rent the entire dorm here for a wedding or family reunion, which I just think sounds adorable. You can click the link in the description if you'd like to learn more about all that. And thing number two, if you or your company or a group you're part of would like to learn more about how to help with the sawmill restoration efforts through donations or volunteer opportunities, you can find more information at BaragaCountyHistoricalMuseum.com. That link will also be in the description. Thanks again to Michigan Tech and the Baraga County Historical Society for supporting this video and, honestly, for finally giving me the opportunity to learn about Alberta. And thanks to you for being here. I hope you learned something that makes you think about the world just a little differently, and I'll see you soon.